Admiral Zethkar stood before the massive holographic display in the council chamber, aboard the flagship Eternal Harmony. The blue light from the projector cast strange shadows across his scaled face as he watched the footage for the 10th time that day. On the screen, human soldiers moved through the wreckage of what used to be the Korthani Third Fleet. They moved like predators, checking corners, securing areas, and helping their wounded with an efficiency that made his stomach turn. The Galactic Defense Council had gathered from across the galaxy for this emergency meeting. Representatives from 47 different species sat in their specialized chairs, their various forms of breathing apparatus humming quietly in the recycled air. The chamber was built to accommodate everyone from the towering crystalline beings of Zerion to the small, furry creatures from the Palm worlds. Today they all shared the same expression of concern. "Play the section from the boarding action again," General Vixtha said from her seat. Her forearms were folded across her chest and her usually purple skin had turned a pale gray. She had commanded the Korthani forces during their first encounter with humans 6 months ago. Since then, she barely slept. Admiral Zethkar nodded and gestured to the technician. The hologram shifted to show the interior of a Korthani vessel. The corridors were filled with smoke and the flickering light of damaged systems. Then the humans appeared. They moved in small groups, their black armor making them hard to see in the dim light. They communicated with hand signals and used weapons that seemed simple compared to Council technology. Yet they cut through the Korthani defenders like they were made of paper. When their ammunition ran out, they used knives. When their knives broke, they used their bare hands. When they were wounded, they kept fighting. When they were dying, they kept fighting. "These are supposed to be their regular troops," muttered Ambassador Keftan from the Veltar Empire. His tentacles writhed nervously as he spoke. "They're common soldiers. The ones they send everywhere. The humans call them army," Admiral Zethkar said, reading from his datapad. "According to our intelligence, these represent the basic level of their military forces. They have millions of them." The chamber fell silent except for the various breathing sounds of different species. The footage continued to play, showing human soldiers doing impossible things. They jumped gaps that should have been too wide. They lifted weights that should have been too heavy. They fought on with injuries that should have killed them. "How many ships did they use to defeat the Third Fleet?" asked Representative Yilmoth from the insectoid clusters. General Vixtha's voice was barely a whisper. 12. 12 fleets? No, 12 ships. Against our 300, the silence grew heavier. On the hologram, a human soldier was shown carrying a wounded comrade while still firing at enemy positions. The wounded soldier was also still shooting despite missing an arm. "They don't surrender," General Vixtha continued. "Even when they're cut off, outnumbered and out of supplies, they just keep fighting. Our forces started calling them the Endless Ones because they never seemed to stop coming." Admiral Zethkar changed the display to show tactical information. Red markers showed human expansion across local star systems. In just 2 years, they had established colonies on 17 worlds. Every attempt to stop them had failed. "The Drakari Confederation sent 2 enforcement fleets," he said, pointing to the markers. "The humans defeated both with minimal losses. The methane breathers tried to blockade their supply lines. The humans somehow turned the blockade against them and captured half the fleet." "What about the siege of Gamma Station?" asked someone from the back of the chamber. Admiral Zethkar pulled up more footage. Gamma Station had been a massive orbital fortress, designed to be unbreachable. The humans had taken it in 4 hours. "They used some kind of boarding pods that moved too fast for our sensors to track properly," he explained. Once inside, they split into small teams and took the station section by section. The defenders had superior numbers, better weapons, and the advantage of knowing the station layout. It didn't matter. On the screen, human soldiers moved through the station corridors like ghosts. They seemed to know exactly where to go and what to target. Communications went down first, then life support to non-essential areas, then the weapon systems. By the time the station commander realized what was happening, it was already over. "The humans didn't even use their best equipment," Admiral Zethkar added. "Intelligence reports suggest they have much more advanced weapons and ships. These victories were achieved with what they consider basic gear." Representative Salnix from the Hive worlds raised one of her many arms. "What about their numbers? Surely there can't be that many of them." "That's the problem," Admiral Zethkar replied. "There are billions of them on their homeworld alone, and they're expanding to new colonies every month." Each colony seems to produce more soldiers. The hologram switched to show human training facilities. Rows of soldiers performed exercises that looked brutal even by galactic military standards. They ran for hours without stopping, lifted massive weights, and practiced combat until they collapsed from exhaustion. Then they got up and did it again. They trained constantly, General Vixtha said. Our captured personnel reported that human soldiers spend most of their time preparing for war, even during peace. They call it staying ready. But they're just flesh and blood, protested Ambassador Kefton. They don't have the genetic enhancements of our finest warriors. No cybernetic upgrades. No psionic abilities. How can mere biological creatures be so effective? Admiral Zethkar had wondered the same thing. The humans were smaller than many species, weaker than others, and didn't have any obvious advantages. Yet they won every battle, I think, he said slowly. It's because they don't fight like us. We plan for victory. They plan for survival. We fight until we win or lose. They fight until they can't fight anymore. The council members looked at each other with growing unease. The footage continued to show human soldiers doing things that defied explanation. They fought in conditions that should have been impossible. They adapted to new situations instantly. They turned every disadvantage into an advantage. The question before us, Admiral Zethkar said, is what to do about this situation. Human expansion shows no signs of slowing down. Their military power is growing. And so far, nothing we've tried has worked. We need to use our best forces, declared General Krexthul from the military command. His species was known throughout the galaxy for their warrior culture. Send in the Hegemony Guard, our elite soldiers with the finest equipment and training. Show these humans what real military power looks like. Murmurs of agreement rippled through the chamber. The Hegemony Guard represented the absolute pinnacle of galactic military achievement. They were genetically enhanced, cybernetically upgraded, and equipped with weapons that could level cities. Each guard member was worth 100 regular soldiers. If their common army is this dangerous, General Krexthul continued, then we need to respond with uncommon force. The Hegemony Guard will show them that there are limits to what primitive biology can achieve. Admiral Zethkar looked around the chamber. Every representative was nodding in agreement. The decision was unanimous. They would deploy the Hegemony Guard to end the human threat once and for all. Very well, Admiral Zethkar said. We authorize the deployment of the Hegemony Guard. Full strength. No restrictions on weapons or tactics. We end this human expansion now, before they can develop anything worse than what we've already seen. As the council members filed out of the chamber, none of them noticed the small detail in the intelligence report that Admiral Zethkar had chosen not to mention. In all their encounters with human forces, they had never seen any unit designation higher than regular army or standard infantry. The humans had never used anything they called special or elite forces. Yet. 3 months had passed since the Council's decision, and Commander Tekmol felt confident as his massive fleet dropped out of hyperspace at the edge of the new Sievo system. Behind him stretched the largest military formation the galaxy had ever assembled for a single operation. 50,000 of the Hegemony Guard's finest warriors, aboard 300 ships equipped with the most advanced weapons known to galactic civilization. New Sievo was a young human colony, established only 18 months ago. Intelligence suggested it held about 2 million civilians, and maybe 50,000 of those dreaded human soldiers. Commander Tekmol looked at those numbers and smiled with his razor-sharp teeth. 50,000 Hegemony Guards against 50,000 human regulars. It would be over in hours. All ships report ready for assault, announced his communications officer. The humans appear to be transmitting some kind of message. Put it through, Commander Tekmol said. He was curious to hear what the humans would say when faced with overwhelming force. The message was simple and spoken in clear galactic standard. A human voice, calm and professional, said only, New Sievo Defense Command to approaching Council Fleet. You have entered human territory. Please state your intentions, Commander Tekmol laughed. Transmit our response. This is Commander Tekmol of the Hegemony Guard. You will surrender immediately or be destroyed. You have 1 hour to evacuate all civilian areas. The human response came back immediately. Message received. New Sievo Defense Command out, that's it? Asked the communications officer. No surrender? No negotiations? Humans don't surrender, Commander Tekmol said, remembering the intelligence briefings. But it doesn't matter. Deploy the fleet for standard planetary assault. Target their military installations first. The Council fleet moved into attack formation with practiced precision. Massive dreadnoughts took positions around the planet, while smaller ships prepared to establish orbital control. Everything proceeded exactly according to the tactical manuals that had served the galaxy for centuries. That's when things started going wrong. The first sign was the loss of the supply convoy. 20 ships carrying ammunition and fuel for the fleet simply vanished from sensors. No distress calls, no explosions, no debris. They were there one moment and gone the next. Investigate the convoy's last position, Commander Thekmol ordered. Before the search ships could reach the area, the communications array on the flagship went dead. Not damaged or destroyed, just offline. The engineering teams found nothing wrong with the equipment. It simply stopped working. Sir, reported his sensor officer. We're detecting small craft moving through the fleet. Fast, stealthy, using some kind of technology we haven't seen before. Commander Thekmol studied the tactical display. Tiny blips appeared and disappeared across the screen, moving between his ships like insects. How many ships are they using? Unknown, sir. The signatures are very faint. Maybe a dozen small vessels. A dozen ships against 300. Commander Thekmol wasn't worried. Until the explosion started, the first ship to die was the heavy cruiser Eternal Victory. It was patrolling the fleet's outer edge when something hit its engine section. The ship didn't explode like normal battle damage would cause. Instead, it just stopped. All power went out. Life support failed. 3,000 crew members floating dead in space within minutes. What kind of weapon was that? Commander Thekmol demanded. Unknown, sir. The ship shows no external damage. Something happened inside. More ships began reporting problems. Power failures, computer systems going offline, weapons malfunctioning. The humans weren't destroying the fleet with massive firepower. They were taking it apart piece by piece like mechanics dismantling a machine. Sir, the sensor officer called out. We're detecting boarding pods attached to several ships in the fleet. Commander Thekmol's blood ran cold. The humans were actually boarding Council vessels. In the middle of space combat, they were sending soldiers onto enemy ships. It was insane. It was impossible. It was working. Deploy security teams to repel boarders, he ordered, and find out how they're getting past our shields. The reports from the boarding actions made no sense. Small teams of humans, sometimes only 4 or 5 soldiers, were taking control of entire ships carrying thousands of Council troops. The security recordings showed humans moving through the corridors like shadows, appearing where they shouldn't be able to go, knowing exactly where to strike to cause maximum damage. Captain Sarah Chen led one of these boarding teams as they made their way through the Council dreadnought crushing dawn. Her team of 6 soldiers had somehow gotten aboard a ship that was supposed to be impossible to penetrate. They moved in complete silence through corridors filled with 3,000 enemy troops. Target the bridge first, she whispered into her communication device. Control systems are 2 levels down. Engineering is at the rear of the ship. Move fast, stay quiet, get out clean. Her soldiers moved like they had trained on this exact ship their entire lives. They knew where every corridor led, where every security station was located, where the crew would be positioned during combat. They avoided the main routes and used maintenance passages that barely existed on the ship's blueprints. When Council security teams tried to stop them, the humans vanished. Not retreated, not fell back, but actually disappeared into the ship's structure like they were never there. Minutes later, they would appear somewhere else entirely, having somehow moved through solid walls. Within 30 minutes, Captain Chen's team had taken control of the crushing Dawn's bridge, disabled its weapons, and begun broadcasting false orders to other ships in the fleet. They did it without killing a single enemy soldier. They didn't need to kill anyone. They just needed to create confusion. Sir, Commander Thekmol's communications officer reported, the crushing Dawn is transmitting orders to fall back and regroup. I didn't give those orders. The orders are coming from the ship's captain. Using proper authorization codes, Commander. Thekmol looked at his tactical display. His perfect fleet formation was falling apart. Ships were moving out of position, following orders that made no sense. Communication was breaking down. Supply lines were cut, and somewhere in the chaos, small teams of human soldiers were turning his military advantage into a nightmare. How many humans are we actually fighting? He asked his intelligence officer. Based on the boarding actions and small craft signatures, maybe 200 soldiers total. 200 humans were destroying a fleet of 50,000 council troops. Commander Thecamol stared at the display in disbelief. This wasn't possible according to everything he knew about warfare. The humans should have been crushed by superior numbers and technology. Instead, they were winning by fighting in ways that shouldn't work. "Sir," his sensor officer called out urgently, "we're detecting another human ship approaching. Small vessel only about the size of a frigate. One ship. Deploy a squadron to intercept it." "Sir, the ship is broadcasting an identification signal. It's marked as a special operations vessel." Commander Thecamol felt something cold settle in his stomach. Special operations. The humans had been fighting his elite forces with regular soldiers, and now they were sending something called special operations. "What does that mean?" he asked. His intelligence officer was frantically reading through data files. According to Human Military Organization, regular army units are their standard forces. But they also have classification levels above that. Special forces, elite units, specialized troops. The small human ship was moving through the fleet like it owned the space. Council vessels tried to target it, but their weapons couldn't get a lock. It moved too fast, changed direction too quickly, and seemed to know exactly where every shot would be fired before it was fired. "Sir," the communications officer announced, "we're receiving a message from the human ship." The voice that came through was different from the earlier transmission. Calmer, colder, more professional. "Council Fleet, this is Major Rodriguez of the Human Special Operations Command. You are ordered to withdraw from this system immediately. This is your only warning." Commander Thecamol's hands were shaking as he replied. "This is Commander Thecamol of the Hegemony Guard. We do not take orders from humans." "Understood," came the reply. "Initiating security protocols. What happened next would be talked about in Council military academies for decades." The human special operations ship didn't attack the fleet. Instead, it began broadcasting signals that turned the Council's own technology against them. Ships started firing on each other. Navigation systems failed. Life support began cycling through atmosphere that made crew members sleepy and confused. Within 2 hours, the most elite military force in galactic history was in complete disarray. Ships were drifting powerless through space. Crews were abandoning their posts. The communication network had collapsed into chaos. And through it all, small teams of human soldiers continued their silent work, appearing wherever they were needed to keep the confusion growing. Commander Thecamol realized with growing horror that the humans weren't just better soldiers. They understood warfare on a level that the Council had never imagined. They didn't fight armies. They fought systems, psychology, organization itself. And according to his intelligence files, these special operations forces weren't even the humans' best soldiers. The intelligence officer Lindar had not slept properly in 4 days. Her species required only 3 hours of rest per cycle, but even that small amount eluded her as she worked frantically to decode the human communications they had intercepted during the disaster at New Sarajevo. What she found in those encrypted files would change everything the Council thought they knew about human military capability. The communications center aboard the flagship Eternal, Harmony hummed with activity as dozens of technicians worked around the clock to make sense of the intelligence data. Lindar sat at her workstation, her 6 eyes focused on streams of human text that appeared on her screens. Most of it was routine military communication, but buried within the standard traffic were references that made her blood run cold. Tier 1. Operators deploying to Sector 7, read one message. Black Operations Unit. Charlie requesting extraction. Another mentioned deep cover assets and psychological operations teams. But the most disturbing references were to units identified only by numbers and letters, with no names at all. Lindar had spent her entire career studying military organizations across the galaxy. Every species had elite units, special forces, and highly trained soldiers. But they all followed predictable patterns. Regular troops at the bottom, specialists in the middle, elite forces at the top. Simple hierarchies that made sense. Humans apparently didn't work that way. "Commander Thecamol," she said, calling her superior over to her workstation. "You need to see this immediately." The commander looked terrible. His normally pristine uniform was wrinkled. His scales had lost their shine, and his eyes held the hollow look of someone who had seen too much. The defeat at New Sarajevo had broken something in him that Lindar wasn't sure would ever heal. "What is it, Lindar?" he asked wearily. The humans we fought at New Sarajevo, she said, pointing to her screen. They weren't special forces. What do you mean? That Major Rodriguez identified himself as Special Operations Command. Yes, but look at this. Lindar pulled up the intercepted communications. The units we encountered are classified in human military structure as special forces, but there are references here to forces classified above that level. Commander Thekmal leaned closer to the screen, reading the human text with growing alarm. What is Tier 1? I don't know. But according to these communications, Tier 1 units were never deployed to New Sarajevo. Neither were the Black Operations units or these numbered designation forces. The humans fought our entire fleet with what they consider middle-level troops. The silence in the communication center grew heavy as other technicians stopped their work to listen. The implications of what Lindar was saying spread through the room like a disease. Show me everything, Commander Thekmal said quietly. Lindar had organized the intelligence into categories, each more disturbing than the last. Regular army units were what the Council had been fighting for months. Above them were National Guard forces, then reserve units, then active duty specialists. Then came Special Forces, which was what they had encountered at New Sarajevo. But above Special Forces, the human military structure continued into areas that made no sense according to galactic military doctrine. They have something called Rangers, Lindar explained, which seem to be even more specialized than Special Forces. Above that are Delta Force units, SEAL teams, and something called Special Mission units. But even those aren't the top level. What's above them? Lindar's voice was barely a whisper. Units so classified that they don't have names, only designation codes. And according to these intercepted messages, those units were never even considered for deployment to New Sarajevo. Commander Thekmal stared at the screen in growing horror. Are you telling me that the humans have military forces beyond what we fought? Forces they haven't even used yet? Not just haven't used, Lindar corrected. According to these communications, the humans have rules about when different levels of force can be deployed. New Sarajevo was handled by what they call appropriate response levels. The higher classification units are reserved for what they term existential threats. Down on the surface of New Sarajevo, Major Alex Rodriguez was demonstrating exactly what human appropriate response looked like. His team of 12 operators moved through the abandoned council positions like ghosts studying ancient ruins. They had been tasked with intelligence gathering and area denial, whatever that meant in human military terminology. The council forces had retreated 3 days ago, but they left behind equipment, weapons, and most importantly, detailed records of their military capabilities. Major Rodriguez and his team were methodically cataloging everything, but they were also doing something else that the retreating council forces were beginning to discover. Ghost protocol is in effect, Major Rodriguez said into his communication device. All council assets in the system are now compromised. Recommend they find alternative transportation home. What the council forces discovered as they tried to leave the system was that their ships no longer worked properly. Navigation systems gave false readings. Life support cycled unpredictably. Weapons fired at random intervals. It was as if the ships themselves had become unreliable. The truth was more disturbing. Major Rodriguez's team had spent 3 days installing small devices throughout the abandoned council equipment. Not bombs or obvious sabotage, but tiny computers that could influence how other systems worked. When those systems were brought back to council ships, they carried the infection with them. It's not just electronic warfare, Major Rodriguez explained to his team as they prepared for extraction. It's system psychology. We're teaching their technology to doubt itself. Back aboard the flagship, Lindar was discovering more disturbing details in the human communications. The teams that had defeated the Hegemony Guard were not operating under combat conditions. They were operating under something humans called rules of engagement. They have restrictions, she told Commander Thekmal. Legal and ethical guidelines that limit what they can do during military operations. The forces we fought at New Sarajevo were not using their full capabilities. What kind of restrictions? Lindar pulled up more files. They're not allowed to target civilian areas. They can't use certain types of weapons. They have to try to minimize casualties, even enemy casualties. They have to follow what they call international law and human rights protocols. Commander Thekmal felt his legs go weak. You mean they were holding back? Not just holding back. According to these documents, they were operating under minimum force necessary protocols. They used the smallest amount of military power they thought would be effective. The communications center fell silent except for the humming of computers and the quiet breathing of various species. Everyone was processing the same terrifying realization. The humans had defeated the galaxy's most elite military force while following rules that limited their effectiveness. "There's more," Lindar said, though her voice suggested she didn't want to continue. The communications referenced something called unrestricted warfare protocols. These are apparently scenarios where the rules of engagement are suspended. When would that happen? According to human military doctrine, unrestricted warfare protocols are implemented when humanity faces species-level extinction events or existential threats to human civilization. Under those conditions, all force classifications become available for deployment. Commander Thekmal looked around the communications center at his staff. They were all thinking the same thing. If the humans were this effective while following restrictions designed to limit their capabilities, what would they be like if those restrictions were removed? "Lindar," he said quietly, "in your analysis of human military capability, what is your assessment of our chances if they decide to classify us as an existential threat?" Lindar looked at her screens filled with intercepted human communications. Messages referencing military units that had never been deployed, weapons systems that had never been tested, and protocols that had never been implemented. She thought about the small teams of humans who had dismantled the galaxy's finest military force while following rules designed to protect their enemies. "Commander," she said finally, "I don't think we would survive long enough to surrender." The truth was spreading through the fleet as other intelligence officers compared notes and shared their findings. The humans weren't just militarily superior. They were operating on a completely different level of strategic thinking. They had forces within forces, plans within plans, and capabilities that the galaxy couldn't even imagine. And they had used only the minimum force necessary to make their point. "Sir," Lindar said, looking at one final communication that had just been decoded, "there's something else. The humans are sending a message to the Council headquarters." "What kind of message?" "A diplomatic one. They're offering to negotiate a peaceful resolution to our conflicts." Commander Thekmal almost laughed, but the sound came out as more of a sob. The humans had just demonstrated military capabilities that made the Council's best forces look like children playing with toys, and their response was to offer peace talks. "They're giving us a chance to surrender we." The human ship appeared without warning in the middle of the Council fleet's defensive formation. One moment the space was empty. The next moment a sleek black vessel materialized as if it had always been there. It was no larger than a Council frigate, maybe 300 meters long, with smooth lines that seemed to bend light around them. The ship gave no indication of how it had arrived or where it had come from. Admiral Zethkar stared at the tactical display from his flagship's command center. The human vessel had somehow bypassed every sensor array, every security perimeter, and every early warning system the Council possessed. It simply appeared in the most heavily defended region of Council space like it belonged there. "How is that possible?" he asked his sensor operator. "Nothing can move through our detection grid without being seen." "Unknown, sir. The ship appears to be using some form of technology we haven't encountered before. Our sensors show it's there now, but they show no record of it approaching." The human ship was broadcasting a simple identification signal. The text appeared on Admiral Zethkar's screen in clear galactic standard. "UES Prometheus, Special Mission Unit, Diplomatic Approach." Admiral Zethkar felt his stomach tighten. After the disasters at New Sarajevo, and the intelligence reports about human military classification levels, any ship carrying something called a Special Mission Unit represented a threat he couldn't even calculate. "Sir," his communications officer announced, "the human ship is requesting permission to dock. They want to send over a diplomatic representative." "One ship?" Admiral Zethkar asked. "They're sending one ship to negotiate with our entire fleet?" "It appears so, sir." Admiral Zethkar looked around his command center. He had 200 ships under his command, carrying the remnants of the Council's military forces. The humans were sending a single small vessel to meet with them. Either they were incredibly brave or incredibly confident. Given what he had learned about humans, it was probably both. "Grant them permission to dock," he said, "but maintain full security protocols. I want to know exactly who we're dealing with." What Admiral Zethkar didn't know was that the 12 operators aboard the UES Prometheus had already been studying his fleet for 3 days. They had monitored every communication, mapped every ship, and identified every potential threat before making their approach. By the time they requested permission to dock, they knew more about the Council fleet than its own commanders did. Colonel Maria Santos led the diplomatic team as they transferred to the Council flagship. She was a small woman with graying hair and calm eyes that seemed to see everything. Her 11 team members looked like ordinary humans in simple black uniforms. But their files were so heavily classified that even their names required special clearance to access. "Remember," Colonel Santos told her team as they prepared to board the Council ship, "we're here for information gathering and diplomatic contact. Use minimum necessary force if things go wrong, but try to avoid making things go wrong in the first place." "What if they try to detain us?" asked one of her operators. "Then we leave," Colonel Santos said simply. "But let's not give them a reason to try." Admiral Zethkar met the human delegation in the flagship's main conference room. He had assembled his best diplomatic staff and security personnel, though he wasn't sure what good either would do against humans. The room was designed to be impressive, with high ceilings and displays showing the power of the Council fleet. Colonel Santos entered the room with only 2 of her team members. The other 9 had remained aboard their ship, which was still docked to the Council flagship. She looked around the conference room with professional interest, noting the exits, the security positions, and the various alien species present. "Admiral Zethkar," she said, offering a slight bow, "thank you for agreeing to meet with us. I'm Colonel Santos representing human interests in this region." "Colonel Santos," Admiral Zethkar replied, "before we begin, I must ask about the nature of your arrival. How did your ship reach us without being detected?" Colonel Santos smiled slightly. "We used a different approach route. Humans have developed some new navigation techniques recently. What she didn't mention was that the UES Prometheus had spent the last week hiding inside the Council fleet's own formation. It had attached itself to the hull of one of their supply ships and traveled with them for 6 days while its crew studied everything about Council military operations. When they were ready to reveal themselves, they had simply detached and powered up their systems." "I see," Admiral Zethkar said, though he clearly didn't. "Colonel, we need to discuss the recent misunderstandings between our peoples. The Council is concerned about human expansion and military activities." "Of course," Colonel Santos replied. "Humans are also concerned about Council military activities, particularly the deployment of your hegemony guard against civilian colonies." The conversation that followed would be remembered as one of the strangest diplomatic meetings in galactic history. Admiral Zethkar tried to negotiate from a position of strength, reminding Colonel Santos that he commanded 200 warships and thousands of trained soldiers. Colonel Santos listened politely and occasionally asked questions about Council military doctrine and strategic planning. What Admiral Zethkar didn't realize was that Colonel Santos's questions were not random. Each inquiry revealed more information about Council capabilities, weaknesses, and decision-making processes. By the time the meeting was half over, she had learned more about Council military organization than most Council officers knew. "Admiral," Colonel Santos said during a pause in the negotiations, "may I ask why you believe your current military position gives you an advantage in these discussions?" "Colonel, I have 200 ships and 50,000 troops under my command. Your people have demonstrated impressive capabilities, but surely you understand the mathematics of warfare." Colonel Santos nodded thoughtfully. "You're right that mathematics are important in warfare, but I think we might be using different equations." "What do you mean?" Instead of answering directly, Colonel Santos made a small gesture to one of her team members. The operator touched something on his wrist device, and the lights in the conference room briefly flickered. "Admiral," Colonel Santos said calmly, "could you check with your engineering staff about your fleet status?" Admiral Zethkar looked confused but gestured to his communications officer. Within moments, reports began coming in from across the fleet. Power fluctuations on multiple ships, navigation systems showing incorrect readings, weapon systems cycling through diagnostic modes, life support running efficiency tests on all vessels simultaneously. "What's happening?" Admiral Zethkar demanded. "Your fleet is experiencing some technical difficulties," Colonel Santos explained. "Nothing dangerous, but your ships are currently not combat ready. This should resolve itself in a few hours. How? Admiral Zethkar's voice was barely controlled. How did you do this? Colonel Santos looked apologetic. Admiral, my team has been studying your fleet for several days. We noticed some vulnerabilities in your computer systems. We've installed some temporary modifications that will help illustrate our point about mathematics and warfare. The truth was more complex than Colonel Santos made it sound. While she had been conducting diplomatic discussions, her other 9 team members had been systematically infiltrating every ship in the Council fleet. They hadn't used weapons or explosives. Instead, they had installed small devices that could influence how the ship's computers communicated with each other. The devices were designed to create confusion rather than damage. Ships would receive false sensor readings, making them think enemies were approaching when nothing was there. Communication systems would randomly change frequencies, making coordination impossible. Weapon systems would target empty space or worse, other Council ships. This is an act of war, Admiral Zethkar said, though his voice lacked conviction. No, Admiral, Colonel Santos replied gently. This is a demonstration. An act of war would involve the permanent destruction of your fleet and the elimination of threats to human security. This is just a temporary inconvenience to help you understand our perspective on fleet mathematics. Admiral Zethkar looked around the conference room. His security staff was trying to look professional, but he could see the fear in their eyes. The humans had just demonstrated the ability to neutralize his entire fleet without firing a shot, and they had done it while sitting in his conference room drinking his coffee. What do you want? He asked finally. We want to avoid unnecessary conflict, Colonel Santos said. Humans have no interest in conquest or domination. We just want to be left alone to develop our colonies in peace. In exchange, we're prepared to share some of our technological innovations with the Council. And if we refuse? Colonel Santos was quiet for a moment, choosing her words carefully. Admiral, you've seen what our regular forces can do against your military. You've experienced what our special operations units are capable of. The 12 people on my ship represent capabilities that are significantly beyond what you've encountered so far. Significantly beyond. The forces you've fought represent human military capabilities designed for regional conflicts and defensive operations. My team represents capabilities designed for strategic-level operations. 6 months after the meeting aboard Admiral Zethkar's flagship, the Galactic Defense Council convened an emergency session for the second time in less than a year. But this time, they weren't planning military action against humanity. They were trying to understand what they had gotten themselves into by making peace with them. The Council chamber aboard the Eternal Harmony looked different now. Where once holographic displays had shown fleet positions and battle plans, now they showed trade routes, technology exchanges, and diplomatic communications. The change in atmosphere was remarkable, but so was the underlying tension that came with knowing exactly how dangerous their new neighbors really were. Ambassador Elena Vasquez stood at the center of the chamber, much as Admiral Zethkar had done months earlier when planning humanity's destruction. But where the Admiral had needed massive holographic displays and hundreds of staff members to present his military intelligence, Ambassador Vasquez stood alone with a simple datapad, looking completely relaxed. She was a middle-aged woman with silver hair and the kind of calm confidence that came from representing a species that had nothing to prove to anyone. Her diplomatic credentials were impeccable, but her security clearance was even more impressive. She was authorized to speak for humanity on matters of galactic policy, which meant she had access to information that made the Council members deeply uncomfortable. Honored representatives, she began, her voice carrying easily through the chamber's translation systems. I want to thank you for agreeing to formalize our treaty arrangements. Over the past 6 months, human-Council relations have improved dramatically, and we hope to continue building on that progress. General Vixtha, who had commanded the forces defeated by human regular army units almost a year ago, raised one of her forearms. Ambassador Vasquez, before we proceed with treaty negotiations, the Council has some questions about human military capabilities. For security planning purposes. Of course, General. What would you like to know? The forces we encountered during our misunderstandings, where do they rank in human military organization? Ambassador Vasquez consulted her datapad briefly. The regular army units you first fought represent our baseline military capability. The special forces teams you encountered later represent our mid-level specialized units. The special mission unit that conducted our diplomatic contact represents our higher-level strategic capabilities. And above that, General Vixtha's voice was barely steady. Above that, we have several classification levels that are typically reserved for existential threats to human civilization. Those units are rarely deployed and operate under different command structures. The chamber fell silent. Admiral Zethkar, who was attending as a military advisor, leaned forward in his seat. Ambassador, during our negotiations, Colonel Santos mentioned strategic operations units. Are those the highest level of human military capability? Ambassador Vasquez looked thoughtful. Strategic operations units are designed to neutralize threats at the civilization level. They represent significant capabilities, but they're not our most specialized forces. There are levels above strategic operations? The question came from Representative Salnex of the Hive Worlds, and her voice carried a note of disbelief. Human military doctrine recognizes that some threats require responses beyond conventional strategic operations. We maintain certain capabilities for scenarios involving species extinction events, time-critical planetary defense, and... She paused, choosing her words carefully. Other contingencies that we hope never to encounter. The council members looked at each other with growing alarm. They had made peace with humanity, based on the assumption that they had seen the limits of human military power. Now they were learning that those limits might not exist. Ambassador, Admiral Zethkar said slowly, when Colonel Santos's team disabled our fleet, was that representative of strategic operations capabilities? Oh no, Admiral. Colonel Santos's team was operating under diplomatic protocols with strict limitations on their actions. They were specifically instructed to demonstrate capability without causing permanent damage or loss of life. A strategic operations response would have been more decisive. More decisive how? Ambassador Vasquez looked genuinely reluctant to continue. Admiral, diplomatic protocols require me to be honest with you, but some information might be disturbing. Are you sure you want the details? Admiral Zethkar looked around the chamber. Every representative was nodding. They needed to know what they were dealing with. Please continue. Ambassador. A strategic operations response to your fleet would have involved the permanent neutralization of all military assets and command personnel. Your ships would have been disabled beyond repair. Your communication networks would have been permanently compromised, and your command structure would have been eliminated through targeted operations. The entire engagement would have been completed in approximately 6 hours with 0 human casualties. The silence in the chamber was deafening. Ambassador Vasquez continued in the same calm, professional tone. However, that would still have been considered a limited response under human military doctrine. A full strategic operations deployment would have included neutralization of your home bases, supply systems, and the military infrastructure of all participating council species. All of it? Whispered General Vixtha. All of it, General. Strategic operations units are designed to end threats permanently. They don't just win battles. They eliminate the enemy's ability to fight future battles. Representative Keftan from the Veltar Empire was making notes on his datapad with shaking tentacles. Ambassador, you mentioned classification levels above strategic operations. What would those be used for? Ambassador Vasquez was quiet for a long moment. Those units are designed for threats that could end human civilization. Scenarios involving hostile artificial intelligence, species-killing plagues, reality-altering phenomena, or enemies with capabilities beyond our current understanding. They operate with no restrictions on tactics, technology, or collateral damage. No restrictions at all? None. When humanity faces extinction, we respond with everything we have, using every method available, with no concern for anything except survival. Admiral Zethkar felt his throat go dry. Ambassador, during all our conflicts with humanity, what level of force were your people actually using? Our lowest level, Admiral. Baseline military responses with full diplomatic protocols in effect. We were specifically trying not to escalate the situation or cause unnecessary casualties. And if we had been classified as an existential threat, Ambassador Vasquez looked directly at Admiral Zethkar. Then this conversation wouldn't be taking place, Admiral. Neither would any of us. The weight of that statement settled over the chamber like a heavy blanket. The Council had been planning humanity's destruction, while humanity had been trying to avoid hurting them. The humans had held back their most effective forces, followed rules designed to protect their enemies, and offered peace negotiations even while demonstrating overwhelming military superiority. Ambassador, Representative Salnik said quietly, why didn't humanity simply eliminate the Council when we posed a threat? You clearly had the capability. Because that's not who we are, Ambassador Vasquez replied. Humans believe in proportional response and diplomatic solutions. We don't solve problems by destroying everyone who disagrees with us. We prefer to find ways to coexist peacefully. But you could have ended the conflict quickly if you wanted to. Yes. But choosing not to use maximum force doesn't mean we can't use it. It means we prefer not to use it. Admiral Zethkar stood up slowly from his seat. Ambassador, I need to ask a question that may sound strange. Go ahead, Admiral. What would happen if humanity decided to expand aggressively? If you chose to conquer other species instead of coexisting with them? Ambassador Vasquez was quiet for a very long time. When she finally spoke, her voice was softer but somehow more frightening than before. Admiral, humanity spent most of our history fighting ourselves. We developed our military capabilities through thousands of years of warfare between human factions. Every tactic, every strategy, every technology we've shown you was originally designed to fight other humans who were just as capable as we are. She looked around the chamber, making eye contact with each representative. The forces you've encountered were designed to fight enemies who understand human capabilities, who can match human adaptability, and who know human weaknesses. When we fight other species, it's not really fighting. It's more like adults dealing with children who are having a tantrum. Are you saying we never had a chance? I'm saying that humanity has never considered other galactic species to be military threats. Your neighbors we prefer to get along with, but you were never enemies we needed to prepare for. The chamber was completely silent now. The representatives of the galaxy's most powerful civilizations were processing the fact that humanity had never seen them as serious opponents. Ambassador, General Vixtha said finally, what should we do with this information? Thank you for watching and comment for next part.